Welcome to the first ever episode of the Slovo Podcast, and I'm your host Ubersoy from a culturally right-wing channel called Ubersoy. The Slovo Podcast was created with the sole purpose of inviting people who share similarities with the right-wing thought in order to enhance it and educate the listener about it. And the honorary title of the first guest on the show will go to Doomerpolitics, whose video titled Vaush is unironically evil has recently went viral on YouTube, being endorsed from people all across the political spectrum and receiving huge appraisal from Vaush fans themselves and from those on the right of the political spectrum, such as Sargon of Akkad, The Quartering, Lauren Chen, and many more. And frankly, I can't recommend your video enough to people because it was so good. But what was your intention behind producing this video, and is it a fair assumption that you, like many other leftists, at some point were a fan of Vaush?
So the video basically started off as a criticism of online politics generally. A lot of the sections are things that are big problems, not just for Vaush, but for everyone. Like in particular, the whole React Andy thing, equivocation, spreading of misinformation. These are pretty big problems that everyone engages in, even people that I like and agree with.
That's right. I've seen your video with Vadim. Why did you delete it?
I deleted it because it is a garbage cringe video that I could. It's not a good video.
Okay. I see you're a perfectionist. That's good. Because your video about Vaush was very high quality. In fact, I produced a video on systemic racism, and it seems like you did a better job at exactly providing the review for it. Almost like I read it almost like a literature review, and I used some of your sources in my next video, so that was pretty good. But the overall tone of your video also and the delivery makes me wonder what are you doing in real life? I'm assuming you're a university student. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm a university student. Also, you asked a question I didn't answer.
Okay.
So yeah, part of the reason I did choose Vaush was because I did have a general higher opinion of him than some other people in online politics. So like, I wouldn't bother making a video about Mike from PA, for example, just because.
Were you disillusioned with Vaush?
Now I'm pretty disillusioned with Vaush.
But how did it happen? Why did you start recording? What was the moment?
So I knew that there are times in the video where I allude to things that I think other people would likely think. Those were usually things that I thought. So like, I knew something was wrong with Vaush. I knew something was off. I didn't know how bad it was. Like the exact moment when I got really upset with him was watching the video of him telling people to go harass the cop.
Oh,
that was really.
It's not even the worst from Vaush actually. Like when I didn't know about that after watching your video, but when I was watching your video, I was like, well, of course it's something that Vaush will do, and you were very surprised he actually did that. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's TOS, first of all. Like, you don't do that. But beyond that, it's just so inhuman.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And what's kind of funny is that people probably get this idea that I'm a police simp, and I'm really not. I just hate bad arguments and like, Vaush is so exaggerated about the police that I'm forced to defend them, even though I'm not personally a big fan of the police. But yeah. So
why are you not a fan of the police? What is wrong with them?
I mean, I've just personally had bad interactions with the police in my life.
Yes, that makes sense. Are you in where did you grow up in?
I grew up, I guess, in Ohio and Florida. I don't live there anymore.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure how bad the police in those areas, but usually, from what I know, it depends on the area. And people look at you as a suspect if you're from some area. Which brings us to the question about systemic racism. Why do you think it's not real? Well, against blacks, presumably.
Well, I do think it's real against blacks. So I didn't say that in the video. I affirmed. Yeah, so I affirmed that there is systemic racism and non-lethal police use of force. There doesn't seem to be any evidence for lethal police use of force. So like,
yes.
yeah. So so I was responding to Vaush's claims that are just like, I mean, exaggerated to a level of hyperbole where debunking it is almost not worth the time because it's so just obviously on its face wrong. That like, if you know, like statements like the cops just want to roll into minority communities and just murder people, right?
Yes, that's obviously ridiculous. Can you expand more on the non-lethal systemic racism part?
Yeah. So systemic racism is a long conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I am not a fan of that phrase because it communicates a lot of things that I think can be confusing and or
That's right.
inaccurate. So I use the phrase systemic racism to mean one of two things.
Mm-hmm.
One of those things would be demonstrable inequitable outcomes without a good explanation, and the other would be the effect of historic discrimination. And in either case, I think that you can make an argument that they exist. My problem is that people often exaggerate the degree to which it exists.
Yeah, there is an argument from actual justice warrior with regards to policing of the black neighborhoods. It seems to me that police are concentrated in the neighborhoods where there is most crime, and when there are more calls for police to look for that neighborhood. In fact, in New York, they have some sort of a tracking system, which, as far as I know, don't even looks at race, and still you have those outcomes. Would you consider this to be systemically racist?
So I need to try and be very careful in my language. So again, so the first step for establishing that something is a part of systemic racism is noticing that there is an inequitable outcome, and then there has to also be an inadequate explanation for that outcome. So, for example, it's just factual that if you look at America, black people commit more violent crime per capita than white people. So, an obvious reality that's going to go along with that is that black people are going to have more interactions with the police, and in particular, more dangerous interactions with the police, because you wouldn't expect the police to get into violent interactions with just a random person that's not doing anything. You would expect police to get into a violent altercation with someone for whom is already engaged in violence, right? So just something that really bothers me is when people just use population benchmarks. So I actually worked as a criminal justice researcher for quite a while. Population benchmarks don't make sense. It also doesn't make sense to just compare America to other countries. So, for example, people will compare America's police statistics to police statistics in Europe, but there are some very, very obvious differences between our societies. Like we have far more firearms, for example. So a police officer in America who's in a violent situation has very good reason to believe that their life is in danger at all times in a way that wouldn't exist.
That's a good point.
And in Europe, and so there's something that comes out of this. So
yes,
in America, so yeah. So I was just going to say, in America, everyone knows that if you are talking to the police, that you are to be on your absolute best behavior. And there is a good reason for that, because people who are not on their best behavior with police have very good reason to be worried about what it is that you might do. If someone is being belligerent to a police officer in Britain, the likelihood that that is going to end in a lethal altercation for that police officer, I don't know the exact difference, but it is a very different situation, right? The likelihood of that cop being killed is very, very, very low. And to be clear, in America, it's also quite low. It's not likely that it's not a very common occurrence that police get killed, but the danger is a very real and present thing, right?
Another common occurrence is police killing unarmed people. Uncommon, should I say. Anyways, do you mind if I just push you one more time on the systemic racism? It seems to me that at least one of your definition was to argue that it exists because of a difference in outcomes, and then you look into if there are no other sufficient explanations, right? Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah. So
yes. So here's the follow-up. And the follow-up seems to me that black people, and we can debate to what extent it is genetic or environmental. I think that when it comes to crime, there is a huge environmental degree to that. but black people are still committing a lot of crimes, and it does not seem to be that the system is telling them to commit these crimes in whatever way it may do so, right? I think a better definition of a systemic racism, at least for me, and let's see if we agree on that, is something that is ingrained in the law or in institutions, where one group of people, for example, like Ashkenazi Jews in the past or blacks in the past, were treated differently than the group of people who was in power. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so this is sort of touching on a broader thing. A lot of the definitions that get used when talking about things like systemic racism become a form of equivocation, because what you just said is what people think when you hear a term like systemic racism. They think basically the sort of things that we did away with for the most part during the civil rights movement, which was to go through the law and make sure that we don't have any form of explicit discrimination in the law. So that's the sort of thing, obviously, that I would have the most.
I would probably object and say that there are things like affirmative action and diversity training, and I think those contribute to some unequal outcomes, I would say, and they work in favor of blacks.
Sure. I don't think that the effect of affirmative action is going to be quite the same as like the legacy of some of the things that have happened in the past.
Yes,
but personally,
well,
yeah. So
it's
personally,
hard to measure it. Yeah, go ahead.
It's hard to measure it. So I like to try and be clear with language,
Yes.
and I prefer non-hostile language. So I think the term systemic racism has a tendency to put people off. When I say the lingering effects of historic discrimination, people have a lot less of a problem with that, because everyone understands that for a long time our country was not fair to black people, and there are still some effects on our society that very clearly, everyone will acknowledge, at least in part, these things are caused by demonstrable inequities in the past that are of exactly the type that you identified, where it's not just that people didn't like black people, there were laws on the books to discriminate against them. Yeah. So
here's the issue that I find with it. It's that it is very hard to measure to what extent those legacies still manifest themselves.
Sure, but I mean, it's at least obvious to me that like there's something there, right? But personally, I don't like identity politics very much. I don't like. I think that fixating on immutable classes in the way that people do is, generally speaking, unhelpful. And to me, it's obvious that those inequities exist. But I think the best solution to that is to implement social democratic policies that don't.
Okay, we'll return to it
specified by race
in a bit, because I'm also curious. I know that you're a social democrat, and perhaps we could discuss it, in the future of this video. But I'd like to return, to the main meat of this video. It was your viral video titled "Vaush is unironically evil," and I do have still some questions about it. So, for example, is it true that perspective philosophy helps you out on the Vaush's morality? What do you say?
So I talk in Perspective Philosophy's Discord server.
Yes.
I asked him to help, and he didn't.
Oh, okay. It was certainly the claim of President Sunday that he did it for you. So
yeah, he thinks a lot of things. That guy has
we'll get into it just in a bit.
No, so just to be clear, and this isn't revealing. I'm not. So I have very strict ethical standards about revealing private conversations or even acknowledging that they happened. Really.
Okay.
Lewis. So Lewis did not help me at all,
okay.
and I specifically asked him for his help. I don't know why, but he did not help me. Some of the other people in his Discord helped me, but it wasn't like I didn't pay any of them. It was just like, hey, here are certain ideas. Like if you go back,
sent it to a couple of people, and that was very how to say courageous. And frankly, I rarely do that. Only on a topic that I don't know much about. I usually send it to other people to critique. That was very good.
Yeah. So like one of the things that happened in that server was like, I didn't know the correct phrasing for what Gorgias was. I didn't know whether you called it a Platonic dialogue or a Socratic dialogue or something like that. So that was a specific question that I asked them. It's like, how would I talk about this? What is the appropriate phrase to use to describe this piece of writing? In general, I showed them a cut of the morality section before the video was released, but no, I don't think anyone commented on it aside from saying that's cool.
Okay,
yeah.
From watching it, it was very good. You got it straight to the point. That is a consequentialist philosophy. I did a video on utilitarian philosophy, and I did produce a similar critique. Very good. Anyways, I said how good you are for like what is it, 15 minutes. Here's some critique. It's one of such people who criticize you was President Sunday, with whom you have engaged a couple of times, and frankly it was far from civil, and I hope I'm doing a good job here at being civil. And yes, I am on your side, but and his second video, he produced about you 2 videos as far as I know, was rather weak, because he blamed Sam Harris for not making an argument about systemic racism for some reason, coming, I guess, from his own subconscious refusal to accept group differences in intelligence. But that aside, his first video was pretty on point. At least he had one point that I very much agree with, and I even thought about it when I first watched your first video. So it's basically that you have 2 different definitions. You have Vaush's definition of white supremacy and Kondankala's definition of white supremacy. Now, Vaush stretches his definition to so that it could encompass approximately 50% of regular people and 84% of intelligence experts. By the way, I'm referencing Heiner Rinderman's paper on expert survey on IQ, while Count Dankula's definition seemed to include in itself, well, certainly probably a few percent of people. And I think President Sunday did have a point here. What do you say about it?
So you're bringing up the differences in their definitions?
Yes.
So it's irrelevant because the point wasn't that they're identical. I said in the video they're not identical. The point was that Vaush is attacking Dankula's definition in ways that equally apply to his own definition.
Well,
so Vaush is, for example, Vaush is saying, well, like Vaush is attacking his definition for being very unacademic. The definition he presents is also incredibly unacademic. And the point isn't even that. The point is trying to establish a trend in the conversation. And this is very amusing for a reason I'll get to in a second. The point is establishing a trend in the conversation that Vaush just won't accept anything that Dankula says. Everything that Dankula says, Vaush just attacks. So that's the point that I'm getting at. And then the reason that
made the point. However, the problem is that you did say in your video that they're practically similar. And I and even President Sunday, who, by the way, I'm a right-winger and I seem to agree with him, they're not that much similar, really. Dankula's definition applies to like 2% of people, while Vaush, as I said, 84% of intelligence experts agree with, could be classified as white supremacists. I have the definition right in front of me.
I know the definitions.
Yes.
So I have a question for you.
Yes.
Actually 2 questions for you.
Yes.
So I think that you would agree that President Sunday probably hates me more than anyone else does.
Of course, yeah.
And he is a rather pedantic person. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, I don't know him very well, but he certainly hates you.
Sure. Well, he's very particular about
Yes,
words.
yes.
Okay, we can put it that way. Okay, so I'm curious. Why is it the first time that he watched this and the first time he made a video shitting on me that he didn't notice the difference between the definitions?
Well, sorry. Is that true? He didn't notice the difference.
100%.
Okay.
It's 100% true.
Okay,
yeah.
well,
he didn't notice a difference.
If that's the case, then too bad for him. Look, I think that we both know that he's very biased. However, the point that he made, and even I made this point, I think what you could have done a better job had you actually focused on like saying how Vaush uses this definition to discredit people and label people he doesn't like as white supremacists, fully knowing well that in the current age, to be a white supremacist is even worse than to be a pedophile. I think if you actually focused on that one, you would have made like, your video would have been like 10 out of 10. Now it's like 9 out of 10. Still good, but
I mean, I understand. Yes. I think that the change that I should have made is I should have just cut the part where I said they were almost identical and just left the critique.
That's not
because
true
the critique is fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It is.
I mean,
fine.
I do think it is true. Okay, so here's the thing.
Yes.
This is a debate that people are going to watch live. If people watched it live and they just gave their definitions and I didn't write them down, color code them, put them on the screen, and then have someone sit there, pause the frame and look at them, if people had just watched the debate, I maintain that I don't think anyone would notice the difference. They just basically gave the colloquial definition of white supremacy.
Didn't notice the difference either, it seems. I guess you might have some point, but I very much noticed this.
Yeah, you're the first person I've talked to who has claimed to have noticed a difference the first time through.
The first time, yes, because I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with those people who like to label people they don't like as white supremacists. So and they go with Vaush's definition as broad and as vague as possible, so it could be applied to like anyone. So I'm very, because I'm familiar with it. I think.
Yeah. Also.
Yes.
Yeah. Also, let me. So that section also is interesting because there's a lot that I cut from that section.
Oh.
So the initial.
Yes.
The initial argument that I was going to make was attacking the Vaush's definition. It wasn't even talking about hypocrisy. I was basically saying that this gives you the room to, like, I was basically saying that Dankula's response to this gives you the room to call anyone a white supremacist is accurate. Yes. And that's the problem with this definition. And then beyond that, the problem that gets beyond it is that it's an equivocation, because not only does he have the room to call anyone a white supremacist, but then after calling anyone a white supremacist, people are going to recall the colloquial definition of white supremacy, which is basic. Oh, sorry.
I'll cut it off when the video. Yeah.
My bad. Let me turn my phone off. Yeah. So the problem is that once you take this incredibly loose definition, and you start using it, and you start basically calling anybody a white supremacist, because
that's right.
For the audience, under the sort of definition that Vaush wants to establish, basically anyone who is okay with the state existing is a white supremacist. Like it's broad to a point that is.
I mean, I wouldn't say states existing is a definition of
he would argue that the American government is a white supremacist entity.
Of course. Oh yeah.
So if you agree with the existence of the American government, then you would be a white supremacist, because not only do you benefit from
I think Vaush is a white supremacist. He has done a very good job at endorsing Joe Biden and shilling for other things like the U.S. state official foreign policy.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's like these things. These are very, very silly claims to make.
Yes.
And then once he's allowed to equivocate like this and call basically anyone a white supremacist, then people will just recall the colloquial definition of white supremacy, which is someone that thinks there's something intrinsically superior about white people and wants to direct policy in that regard. Basically, somebody who would want to establish an ethno-state or return to Jim Crow laws or something like that. So the entire line of argument that he's trying to go down is just. It's crazy. Like you can't.
Yes. Oh.
You can't.
Oh.
Yeah.
You don't have to tell me.
Yeah. Exactly. So that was the initial critique. Now the problem with that critique, first of all, it's a very difficult. Okay. Vaush doesn't explicitly state this. He implies it, and it is very clear to me from having watched all of his content and knowing his ideology, knowing his educational background. I know exactly what he was getting at, but I can't quite prove it. He doesn't spell it out. He doesn't say, I'm talking about the sociological definition of white supremacy, but he does say it's incredibly vague. So he purposefully expands it to this ridiculous degree,
yes.
But it's hard to directly attack when he does a poor job of defining it, which is funny because he's attacking Dankula for basically like being too vague and having this non-academic definition.
Being too vague. Did he really say that? I think I've forgotten it.
I think so. I don't remember exactly, yeah. But he's making these attacks on Dankula's definition that apply to his own definition before and after he clarifies it. And it just as several other points, like one of the points is that Vaush is clearly pivoting. He gives one definition, then gives a different definition. Again, Sunday conceded that. Sunday conceded the fact that there's hypocrisy, that Vaush is attacking his definition for things that apply to his own definition.
Yes.
Yeah, I just don't, again, it's really nitpicking. You know,
Yes.
you're so
No,
far away
I
from the
mean,
argument. Yeah.
I totally agree, and you did very well. You know, when you talked with him and the other leftist fellow traveler, even you like you should be like given a medal because you were pretty well there. And you did make a lot of points, and even the people who watch those channels, they also seem to agree with my assertion. But you know, I think he did make one point, and I think we already talked about it, right? Unless you want to return. I have one more question about President Sunday.
Oh, sure.
Yes, will you do any sort of a community post addressing his criticism? Because as far as I know, he's doing like a third video about you as we speak, and any other people who will challenge your conclusions in your video.
No, I mean, let's just put this bluntly. This guy is like harassing me. He's like making video after video shitting on me. He's in the chat of every stream that I go on. He is personally insulting me on Twitter. He's dredging up Discord logs to attack me. I mean, this guy is like deranged. Okay. So I'm just trying to ignore him. And personally, I think that his criticisms are incredibly bad. Like if you go and watch me talk about the video with people,
his second video was definitely not comparable to his first one. But what if it's another person, not President Sunday, another leftist or a right winger will critique some of the parts of your video? Will you address it somehow or? No.
So yesterday I wrote and recorded a video that was going over all the most common criticisms. I figured I would wait on that a little bit because maybe people will find things that are more meaningful.
Yes, that would be great, and there won't be any accusations that you're running away from criticism, as some leftists would like to say.
Yeah, well, the problem is that people will just say that anyway. Like, if I was running away from criticism, I wouldn't like be in the trenches on the YouTube comments of every video talking about me. I wouldn't have gone on all these streams. You know, I wouldn't have accepted the interviews. True. Yeah, like people just. There's a lot of things people say that are just silly. Like the idea that I'm lazy. Like, come on, dude. Like, you can say a lot of things about me. Lazy is not one of them.
Yes.
And running away from criticism. Like, come on.
Yes, well, I mean, that's what I've heard at some Discord leftist space that, you know, they were talking about you. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that you're running away from criticism in any way. It's just, I brought it up because those people think. Anyways, let's return to, like, your personal views and, you know, social democracy, and then I guess we could end this off. You mentioned you were a social democrat. What does it entail, and what does it mean?
So I don't know a precise definition. Basically, what it means to me is that you have a commitment to basically having a state. You have a central government, and there should be a pretty heavy burden on the state to take care of people beyond just the degree of offering basic social services. I would be in favor of pretty advanced social services. So you were talking about things like single-payer healthcare, a lot of welfare stuff, you know, offering time off for women that get pregnant. Just generally speaking, having a high level of, it's kind of like having benefits at a job. I would like the government to offer people a lot of benefits. In my ideal world, your basic level of human subsistence would be taken care of. Obviously, it's not practical to do that now. Personally, most of the movements that I would want towards social democracy aren't just giving people money. They would be directing government money towards research that would allow us to create better technologies and solutions that would actually allow these problems to be solved, rather than just throwing money at the problem.
Okay,
like developing.
So you're a very strange social democrat, because most social democrats would think that you just have to throw some money at the problem and it would solve itself, like the education system.
Yeah. So let me talk about that specifically.
Okay.
So I'm a very practical person. If I don't think something is going to solve a problem, then I don't see a point in even talking about it, right? So like that's why I don't generally like to talk about like capitalism versus socialism, because I've never even gotten past the practical part of that conversation. It's like, could your system even happen? You know, that's where we always get hung up. So in terms of the educational system in this country, I mean, there's two different educational systems. There's the K to 12, and then there's the university system. One thing that people are often pushing for is free college. Personally, I am conceptually very much in favor of free college, but I think the problem with implementing a free college system in the US is that right now I think college is way too expensive, and that the system itself is quite inefficient. Basically, the reason that it's allowed to be so expensive is that the demand is inelastic. So like, I just went back to grad school. The amount of money that I could stand to gain from my degree is such that the degree can be very, very expensive, and I'm still incentivized to go get it.
Oh,
But
by
that
the
doesn't.
way, what is the degree? Sorry to interrupt you.
I'm
If
getting a
you-
master's of statistics.
Oh, that's pretty good. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So there's kind of an inelastic demand problem where if you if you really like, if you have the desire to get a degree, you probably will be willing to go through with it regardless of the cost. And my perception is that has allowed the cost of college in the United States to increase to a level that is pretty ridiculous. And so you don't solve that. Like, you can't just solve that problem by saying, oh, it's free now, because then you're subsidizing something that's incredibly inefficient. So
Okay,
yeah,
do you
I
mind
don't.
if I critique social democracy? And by the way, this comes from a person who is kind of close with social democracy, as I'm in favor of things such as social mobility and, for example, making certain things more accessible and general openness. But here's a critique, and it's brought up by, for example, J.F. Gariepi likes to critique social democracy and communism in particular. Not to say that social democracy and communism are similar, but the critique is that when you incentivize people to live on welfare, they will be more people will be incentivized. So, for example, if you do a lot of benefits for people who are having children, and for example, you'll have a lot of children as a consequence. And I'm not, by the way, have nothing against children. It's just an example. In the same way, you could, for example, incentivize poor schooling by increasing the overall enrollment in a university. How you're doing that? Well, because people are genetically unequal from the start. Now, I mean, I don't know if we'll have an argument about it. We can have an argument, but let's just assume it is true for the second. And as a consequence, when more people are let into the universities, the official level of competency drives down, and you can see that, you can track that by, for example, general surveys of the United States government, the GSS, and you can clearly see that IQ of people who graduate goes down because more people are involved in it. And as a consequence, not only just that, but you've got programs in a university that are more adjusted for people who are lower in G, whose general intelligence is lower than the average. And now essentially that also creates like an inflation of degrees. So I know I complained, I probably ranted for a little while, but what do you have to say to counter some of my points?
Yeah, so you said a number of things. So it was partially about the denigration of credential by expanding the college, and then sort of a general critique of social democracy. So, I mean, my idea wouldn't just be that critique only really applies to society exactly as it exists now. Like, again, in my ideal society,
Yes.
you would just have a baseline level of subsistence, period. So that you wouldn't need to have kids because you wouldn't need to do anything. You would just have a basic level of housing and food, period. It wouldn't matter what you did.
Yes.
So it wouldn't incentivize anything. Now you could say that it enables people to be lazy. And
that's right.
For some, okay, for a lot of people, you would be correct. So I don't have a lot of the ways in which I will not seem like a leftist is I don't have sort of some of the leftist preconceptions about human nature or
Yes.
yeah. So I'm
makes
very
you
yeah.
already a fascist, or at least for me, a very intellectual left winger, like Russell Warren, for example.
Yeah. So I don't believe in like tabula rasa or anything like that.
Yes, good.
I don't have some impression that if you create the kind of reforms that I'm talking about, people will magically become incredibly well behaved. I'm not under any illusions of that. I just don't
Yes.
care. So like it's very, very possible that if you were to create the kind of society that I want, a lot of people would just sit around and play video games all day. Okay. But first of all, I just don't care about that. I acknowledge that would happen to a degree.
Yes.
I find that to be unimportant.
What do
But
you find
beyond
important then? If
what I find important, again, so part of the reason that people argue against this is because of the presuppositions that I have about caring about like individual fulfillment, right? And caring about personal responsibility. So in the society that I have, everyone is able to rise to their potential, basically. Nobody is ever born into circumstances where they're just fucked. And that happens a lot in our
Well,
society as it
that
presently
sounds
exists.
like a bit like tabula rasa, as far as I'm concerned. You mentioned
Well,
you were
it's not tabula
pragmatist.
rasa.
It
I'm
feels
saying
like,
like
yeah, okay.
if there are certain circumstances in our society today where if you're born into them, things are much worse off for you than if you weren't born into those circumstances. I mean, I could give examples. That's nothing to do with tabula rasa. That's just a fact. And I'm saying that my society isn't going to fix the way people behave. I, generally speaking, have a pretty low opinion of the average person. And I understand that in the society that I'm proposing, a lot of people wouldn't work and a lot of people wouldn't do very much. And again, I don't think we can just get there right now. I think that we would need to get there basically through technological innovations. So this would be an attempt to not necessarily create a post-scarcity society, but a society where gathering resources is considerably easier. And you can think about this like a video game, right? If you have a resource simulation game, at the beginning things are very difficult. I want the gathering of resources to be very easy, such that this is supportable. Okay, I'm not saying anything about tabula rasa stuff. I'm acknowledging that a lot of people are just going to sit around and play video games and not do much with their lives. So my main response to that is that that would be bad for those people. But if they want to make a choice that is incredibly bad for themselves, they're free to make that choice, whatever. But that's not a good way to conduct your life, right?
Yes.
It's unhealthy to just exist at the lowest level that you can get by at.
It is
And
unhealthy, but the
yeah,
problem is that your system will just incentivize it even further, and will have a lot of people who are lower in G that would replicate, and that would be socially, I guess, driven, this replication, because you want to change the environment in such a way that, considering you want everyone to be able to self-realize, well, that would essentially lower the standards to practically nothing.
well, so the implication earlier was that like welfare incentivizes having kids. My system doesn't incentivize having kids because you're fine either way.
I mean that's just an example. The bigger, like, the point that I'm trying to say is that when you like increase welfare, people will become dependent on it, and they will be less dependent on themselves, and less dependent on solving like certain conflictual, I guess, situations, because they've already got it. And as a consequence, what often happens is that I mean, there's, by the way, there's not perfect research on that, but there seems to be that the more egalitarian and the more quote unquote against like the living standards are greater than, you know, the average country, the more you are likely to be exposed to mental illnesses. So there's a positive relationship between good living standards and mental illnesses, at least on the national level. So what's your rebuttal?
I mean, okay, so like you're introducing that there might be some negative externalities to moving in the direction that I want to move in, and I'm not going to deny that. I mean, I of course there could be problems. I don't, I'm not God. I don't know everything, right? This is what I would want. This is what makes sense to me. Okay, so there very easily could be problems with moving in this direction, but there are also very much problems with not moving in this direction, right? Like our healthcare system, like our healthcare system has some pretty serious problems. You know,
well,
I don't see any
Darwinian perspective, but
okay, well,
I get, yeah, I know you can make that argument, of course.
Well, I mean, it's not just a Darwinian perspective. Like I can give you a personal example. So I was recently crippled because of something in the healthcare system that I didn't really have any good way to deal with. So I had a job during COVID. I got really sick. It wasn't because of COVID. That's a whole complicated thing we don't need to get into.
Yes.
But I had to quit my job because I was sick and I couldn't work anymore. And then immediately afterwards, I was put in a situation where I had to go get surgery, and I had this. We don't need to go into details, but I had to go through a lot of medical problems that had. I mean, I didn't do anything to like deserve being put in this situation. It's just something that happened. I lost my job, and because of the way that healthcare works in this country, if you don't have a job, your healthcare is in a pretty precarious situation unless you're rich, which I wasn't, right?
Okay.
And even looking in retrospect, I don't know exactly what I could have done that would have made this situation better. But because of that situation, I was put in a very, very bad circumstance healthcare wise. And as a result, my hand is like probably crippled for life. I don't know exactly. It was about 4 or 5 months ago, and it hasn't gotten better. So I'm assuming it's just not going to be doing well, right? But
Yeah,
this is a
I
consequence of
think
having a
you
healthcare system that
yeah,
isn't terribly good, right?
yes, I think you have made your case, and especially, I'm not sure if it's the education system or the healthcare or both, but it seems like I think the healthcare, the United States spends more on healthcare than any other the developed country, yet this is what they have, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. healthcare system is good asterisk for people like that have the money to get healthcare. But if you don't, if you are in certain circumstances, especially if you don't have a full-time job with benefits, our healthcare system is quite poor, and I just don't see a reason for that. As a country, we have a lot of money. We should be able to like this. Just I don't like
Yes,
the phrase. I don't like the phrase "healthcare is a human right" because I don't like the concept of rights. If the government can
yes.
take it away, it's not a right. I don't like that language. But we have enough money to provide for people's healthcare, and I think that's a legitimate grievance that
It
people
is,
have.
yes, that's perfectly legitimate. But okay, can we just like return one more time to my critique? And by the way, I'm very curious. How would you even make this, I guess, utopia? How like what step ought to be made in order to reach there? Because like from an outsider, it seems like to me some version of communism, I guess, with government, and the terrible experiment on mice in the, I believe, 1970s or the 1960s. I think the Universe 21 it was called, or something like that. How'd you get there? And like, should we even?
So sure, I can give you a theoretical example that I think you'll accept. So just to be clear, I don't like communism. I'm not a communist. Okay,
Good.
so I
Yes, but
prefer again,
a
like
lot of
yeah,
people
yeah.
say, "Oh, communism is bad on practice, but it's good in theory." And essentially, your
I
ideal
don't think it's good in
system
theory either.
seems to,
Uh,
oh, that's pretty well. Well, if we ignore private property aside and things like that, when it comes to the living standards and the ability to self-realize, your proposed system is no different than the communist system. So that's why I said it.
Well, I mean, in order to properly critique communism, I'd have to read all these books Marx wrote, and I don't really want to do that. But there's a lot of assumptions that come along with communism that I don't like.
Okay.
Generally speaking, it's that tabula rasa stuff. It's this idea that if we just change society, people will magically become good. No,
Yes.
I don't buy any
Yes.
of that.
Yes. But you
Yeah,
still
so like,
want to change the society and make it more, I guess, to lower the common denominator standard and raise the living, I guess, wages to everyone in a society.
so my basic view is that as long as people have a basic level of like as long as people's basic needs are taken care of, I don't really care who has the shiniest golden toilet seat. Like I don't engage in a lot of the rhetoric surrounding hating rich people
Mm-hmm.
or even necessarily caring about wealth inequality in the way other people do. Most people that would be social democrats would talk about how unfair it is that Jeff Bezos has all this money. I don't care. I don't care how much money Jeff Bezos has, as long as people have health care, right? As long as people aren't like homeless in a country that doesn't really need to have homeless people. As long as like there aren't kids in our country that have food insecurity. That's what I care about. So as long as we're able to provide for the basic needs of people, people can be all the capitalists they want, right?
Okay,
Um,
yes, understand. Here's the question: how do we get there if we want to, assuming?
Yeah, so I was going to answer that.
Mm-hmm.
So one idea I have, and I don't know exactly how practical this is, but it gives you a good idea of the kind of thing that I like, is that we have a program in the United States called STAMP, and it's basically food stamps.
Mm-hmm.
It gives a lot of money to people to basically buy food. And there are some restrictions on this, but they aren't super restrictive. People can basically buy what they want. And it shouldn't be a revelation to propose the idea that a lot of things that Americans eat aren't terribly healthy. So a lot of this probably goes towards buying unhealthy food. And generally speaking, somebody that would be in my position, a social democrat, would be defending that. Oh yeah, let people buy what they want. I don't really like any step of this process. So what I would find ideal is if we were able to find a way to have semi-automated farming that would make the production of food at local areas considerably cheaper. Basically, you would only need, like, let's say you have an automated farming thing, a big warehouse full of farming equipment that's just growing, like, cabbages and tomatoes and carrots and stuff, right? And then you have someone that takes care of that. You are able to produce a large amount of food, and then you basically just stock a grocery store, and anyone can go there and pick up food. That would be an ideal solution for me, because we would be able to use technology to produce food more easily, and we would be able to provide this to people. And then beyond that, we're also addressing another problem, which is that people are eating very, very unhealthy food. So it's like, if you want to get food from the government, you would need to get healthier food from the government, which would be things like tomatoes and carrots and, I don't know, strawberries and whatever, right? Like, eating non-processed food is, generally speaking, much healthier. And this would address a lot of problems at the same time. It would address problems with the healthcare system, because people would be healthier just eating, I guess you could call it whole foods, or just non-processed foods, however you would like to say that. You would address any food insecurity, because you would have the ability to be giving people food. You would be addressing a lot of problems at the same time. And this would be through developing a technological innovation that would mean that in order to solve the problem, we don't just need to throw money at people. Because generally speaking, I don't just like throwing money at people, and I want to try and solve as many problems as we can at the same time. So another one of the biggest problems,
fairly reasonable.
So another one of the biggest problems in the United States that we would have in pushing towards a single payer healthcare system, that, again, as me, an advocate of single payer, I can't ignore this. And so the general state of health in the United States is considerably worse than it is in a lot of other countries. So that makes it much more difficult. So, like, let's compare it to France, for example. France has an incredibly, let's say, generous system in dealing with people, incredibly generous. But France also has, on average, a much healthier population than the United States. It isn't just politically infeasible for the...
They are closing the gap, I should tell you.
They are?
Every national population, the amount of people who are overweight, it increases, and there hasn't been any decrease in any given country that I've seen so far, at least in the West, to decrease their overall people who are overweight. It seems to be a linear increase everywhere. By the just
sure. I haven't looked that up. I can go check that later. But the basic idea is that France can be more bought into the system because their population is healthier. Even if it's getting worse, I mean, I'm sure the United States' population is getting worse, right? The U.S. would still be worse. So if you wanted to move towards a single payer, so if you wanted to move towards a single payer system in the U.S., you would probably need to be imposing some sort of policies that would, at the very least, incentivize people to be healthier. If not, putting forth some sort of restriction to encourage people to be healthier. People meme on, I think it was, what's that dude's name? The mayor in New York who, like, implemented the soda tax to stop people from, like, drinking these enormous sodas. Everybody memes on that. I think that's kind of fine, insofar as those drinks are really, really unhealthy. And I like, my thing is that if something seems to be bad for everyone, I don't have a problem doing things that other people would think are, I don't even know exactly how you would put it, but I don't have a problem imposing some level of restriction on things that are just bad, right?
Yes.
It's not good for people to drink these incredibly sugary sodas. In some cases, you're talking about like 60-70% of your daily calories from just one drink. Yes. And it's horrible on people, right?
It is horrible.
So you can kind of see what I'm getting at. I don't like the idea of just throwing money at problems. I'm a very practical person. This is the direction that I want society to move in, but my solution wouldn't be just elect me and I'll take all the rich people's money and just throw it at the poor people, because that doesn't fix anything.
Yes, yes. We just learned that you're definitely not a libertarian in this conversation. By the way, I like it very much. It seems to be reasonable propositions. However, I mean, I don't believe you have addressed in detail the issue that it would, for example, incentivize a lot of people of lower G. The general welfare, but not what you are proposing right now, because what you're proposing right now is common sense. But so if you want, we could return to it, or we could move on. I
Well,
do have like a
so I think I
yes.
did address it because in our current system, if you're saying that people will be paid to have children, then that would incentivize them. But
Well,
I'm not proposing
that's
a system.
just a example that I'm not even that much concerned about. Again, the main point of that is that, for example, if you give people a lot of welfare, their environment would change as a result of this exposure to welfare, and more people would be then incentivized in order to adopt welfare. So unless you're making an argument now that you're against throwing people money, and you did make an argument like that before, then we're cool. And
I mean, I sort of like you would need to be talking about a level of scale because personally, I have in my life a degree of security, right?
yes,
The sort of the thing that I'm talking about, I already have that, and yet I'm continuing to do things. You know, I'm
well,
continuing to make videos
universal
and do research.
basic income, for example, it would be a very good example of something that I'm talking about, where people who are even in prison, or people who you wouldn't want them to reproduce, they receive $1,000 per year if this happens to be the case. And I think in Alaska they're doing something similar, though on a smaller scale, and in Norway, if I'm not mistaken. This is what I'm talking about.
I mean, you're talking about like dysgenic policies, right?
That's right, dysgenic policies. And if you follow the works of Michael Woodley and many other academics, you'll see that we're already experiencing it, and we have been experiencing it since the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, Michael Woodley's and Edward Dutton's book, At Our Wits, go as far as to say that it started in the late 19th century. If we go by, for example, analysis of complex words, uh, I guess what's it called, reaction times, and a couple of other metrics.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not prepared for like a full
Okay.
conversation on JS
All right.
or JF
Yes.
Garapi memes, right? But I don't think that this is the sort of thinking that should drive society. Yeah, like this doesn't really concern me. The idea that, oh well, we're encouraging lesser people to breed. I don't consider them lesser people,
Well, I'm not
and I
saying.
don't. Yeah,
I'm saying that they have lower G, and the decisions that they will make will be decisions that were informed by people who are lower G. So, for example, they would be more likely to support anti-Semitism, for example, or homophobia, because those. It's very strange, but those are the kinds of behavior that are associated with a lower G. And also, for example, wealth distributism. I'm sure you're against homophobia or anti-Semitism, and this is the kind of people that we might breed. I'm not, by the way, talking about low information voting. I'm not talking about like generally being bad for society, because you know that income correlates with like 0.5 with IQ. Sorry, not income, job performance. Income correlates at around zero point 0.3. So like you'll have a lot of like conspiracy theories of all sorts.
well, there's
I'm
okay.
sure you'll against that,
So so
right? Yeah.
so now you have tripped into an area where I have some knowledge, and this
Okay.
is interesting
Yes.
because okay, so in the five-factor model, the accepted academic definition of personality psychology, this is the accepted model that people use. Intellect is along the dimension of openness, so it's now called openness intellect, right? And G is correlated with what previously used to be called openness at about 0.6, right? And now
Mm-hmm.
you were basically saying that somebody of lower intelligence would be more likely to be like homophobic, for example. I have no reason to believe that would be the case.
Well,
That would relate to discuss sensitivity, which is correlated with conscientiousness. So why is it that somebody of lower intelligence would be more likely to be homophobic?
Yes, so the research by Noel Carl, he compared, well, I forgot the title of the paper, I'll put it in the description, but he looked at the over representation of leftists in academia, and he looked at general positions and compared them to people of lower G, to academics, and to regular people. And in turn, it turns out that the average intelligence of people who, for example, were accepting of homosexuality, they were way higher than people who were not accepting homosexuality. I don't have the numbers right now, but when the video will be uploaded, it will be right on the screen.
I mean, would you accept the idea that people of lower G would be more likely to be influenced by, let's say, dogmatic ideas in society? Like, it would seem like someone that was lower G would be more likely to sort of accept what they were told, right? This seems to be at least a common meme.
I'm not
If that were the
sure
case,
about
then
that,
couldn't,
actually.
yeah.
There are correlations, definitely, but there are also correlations with people who are, I guess, midwits and the trust that they have. So, for example, the more higher in G you are, the more you're likely to trust people in general. And usually, if you look at who controls our culture, which is the left, you'll see that this is essentially driving their overrepresentation in academia, and I regard it sincerely as a form of dogmatism. So,
well, if the left controls society and the left's against homophobia, then even if we have a bunch of dumb people,
well,
it would still
no,
be
no,
likely
no,
that they wouldn't become homophobic, right?
no. Right now I just critique the leftist presence in society. Although they're not homophobic, they are certainly way worse in other regards, and I wouldn't want them to run society if they're thinking that everyone is basically equal, or we ought to equalize outcomes, or that some people are especially bad. And I mean, that's just the start. I have so many pretensions towards left-wingers. So,
Well, that's the thing, is if the left wing is controlling society, then why would you think that, if someone was born into society, they would be more likely to become homophobic? I mean, I'm guessing, I haven't looked at trends, but I'm guessing if I looked at trends that would, of people being polled or being asked questions that would give an indication for homophobic beliefs, that these would be dropping off a cliff. I mean, I've seen some charts from around the time that gay marriage happened, and I know that gay marriage was accepted in a very short period of time. It went from being that like 70% of the population was against it to being that 70% of the population was for it in like less than 5 years. A very short period of time.
Yes, I mean, to be honest, I'm not that concerned about this issue in particular. By the way, I did made a video about homosexuality, and people were accusing me of being homophobic. So, I'm not really like a LGBTQ whatever rights activist at all. I'm just saying, I'm bringing up this as an example that, it's part of a larger frame that people of a lower intelligence, they seem to, for example, that's another example, believe in conspiracy theories. Like, I wouldn't want our society to be run by people who think that, for example, the COVID vaccine is a form of genocide against black people, which seems to be endorsed, at least in some opinion leaders in the black community.
Well, here's a question for you. You just acknowledged that universities are very, very heavily slanted towards left-wing thought, right?
That's right.
And universities have much higher G on average, right?
Not much. If you look at GSS, those who have a bachelor degree, I think it's around 107.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about a bachelor's degree. I'm talking about university professors.
Yes, but it goes down. Okay, I'm interested to see your point. Yeah, go on. Mm-hmm.
So I'm guessing, I haven't seen any of your content, but I'm guessing that to some degree, you would think that the left in academia is bought into a lot of ideas you would regard as conspiratorial, correct?
I would regard as wrong. I mean, I'm not sure what is the definite. Okay, look, I would probably consider white supremacy to be a form of a conspiracy theory. I don't think tabula rasa is a form of conspiracy theory. So just to clear it up, I think most of the left, the main issue with them is that they just seem to believe things that are obviously wrong and have, although let's say they have good intentions, they're spectacularly a failure, and whenever you criticize it, you run into problems. Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I mean, I'm on the left, and I haven't, accused you of being racist or anything like
Oh,
that.
absolutely. Yes, you're. I would say you're one of the good ones. Yeah, go ahead.
I had a comment, but I forget what it was. So generally speaking, I think that everybody is vulnerable to conspiratorial thinking. My dad has a PhD and thinks that the 2020 election was stolen.
Hmm.
You know, like
Yeah.
this just seems to be something. I don't think this has anything personally. I don't think this has anything to do with intelligence. I think that it has more to do with what you could call emotional security, where people rely on certain beliefs to make sense out of the world, and when those beliefs are questioned, people do some very, very strange things. So yeah, I don't think that really correlates with intelligence. Personally, I think that a lot of what you were talking about, I don't think it really correlates with intelligence.
Well,
Specifically, like homophobia, I don't know of any evidence of that. That doesn't make any sense with my understanding of personality psychology.
yeah. I mean, I will put the links in front. By the way, I'm less familiar with personality psychology aside from like Big Five and other things. But
Yeah, the five factor
the
model is the big
evidence
five.
is
Yeah.
really, yeah. But I mean, when you look at not Big Five, but you look at G, the evidence seems to be overwhelming. People of, I guess, let's say, socially conservative or conspiratorial views, they seem to be lower on G across all studies. I
I mean, that
haven't
would
seen anything to contradict actually this.
well, that would depend. I mean, that depends how you define conspiratorial thinking. So like I don't need you to say this. I can say this. The idea that a lot of people on the left have that if you just change society and people will magically become completely different and that human nature will be totally uncorrelated to human nature as we've observed it throughout all of society, that's conspiratorial thinking to me.
Really?
That is it's very, very similar to, yeah, exactly. It's a confirming of a preconception that not only is not supported by evidence, but goes against all available evidence.
I think.
And there's no good reason to believe that.
Yeah.
And the function of that is to confirm preconceptions about the way that society should be run. So basically, it would be like if I said, well, if you just gave everyone housing, everybody would want to work, right?
Mhm.
No,
Yes,
there's no
that's.
reason to believe that.
Mhm.
But this is something that people often use to reinforce their own preconceptions, and I see very little difference between that and other forms of conspiratorial thinking. So like
Well, I wouldn't
flat,
say moralistic fallacy is a form of conspiratorial thinking. I mean, it's clearly false, but it's surely not a conspiracy as far as I'm concerned.
well, it functions in the same way. So like a lot of people, when a lot of people talk about
Okay,
flat Earth, what they fixate,
yes. Mhm.
yeah. So when a lot of people talk about flat Earth, what they fixate on is like, is the Earth flat? But a lot of what goes into that is way different than like the Earth being flat is one of the less important things about the flat Earth conspiracies, from what I
Yes,
understand.
the
It
most
confirms a
important
lot of
thing is that they're hiding from us, supposedly.
yeah. So that's part of it. It also confirms some of their metaphysical beliefs. It confirms cultural beliefs. It confirms all of these preconceptions that people already have packed in, and that all exists before the idea of flat Earth comes up. But when the idea of flat Earth comes up, it's like, oh, here's a way for me to confirm, yes, they are hiding all of this stuff from us. There is something wrong with the world fundamentally. All of these things that they've already been presupposing, now they have something to attach it onto. And that to me is sort of the essence of conspiratorial thinking is you're
Well,
you're
it is
attaching your
really, yeah. It's just I don't think that what like your example or the moralistic fallacy. I don't think it is a form of a conspiracy theory because it doesn't presuppose any like conscious conspiracy of people, hanging out together and just deciding that, oh, we're going to like open this certain system that would make people differently, I mean achieve different outcomes, while in reality they're just about the same, as Stephen Gould liked to say.
well, I mean, it would depend on who you talk to. There are certainly a lot of people who would make an argument that the empirical evidence supports, let's say, communism, and that this is being suppressed by, let's say, the Koch
Oh
brothers.
yes, well
How
that
many
is a
people would argue
conspiracy
that?
theory. Yes, that is a conspiracy theory. That's right. But like I don't think a moralistic fallacy is a conspiracy theory per se. I don't
No,
know.
I was saying it's along the same lines of conspiratorial thinking.
Okay.
Basically, what I'm saying is that I think these forms of thinking are just common to people, and that it's very rare you find someone who doesn't do this to some degree, and that this isn't really correlated with intelligence. And a lot of the
Well,
things that you presupposed
I
were
mean,
correlated with G, I don't think are.
yeah. Well, the listeners will see who was correct and who was wrong. But anyways, I do have like a couple of few questions, and I think then we could end this video. Sorry, what is it? Oh yeah, one last question about social democracy. What kind of evidence would you need in order to be convinced that this is not what you should be striving for?
You mean in terms of adopting a different system?
In terms of adopting, yes, a different system.
I mean, a different system, I'm not sure what evidence there would be. Like, there could obviously be evidence against a particular policy.
Well,
so
that's right. But you did say that you're a pragmatist and you're in favor of things that work, and you're not in favor of just throwing money at randomly. So I think essentially.
Yeah, but I'm not okay. So I'm not proposing that we do my system overnight, right? I think that was pretty clear. So like for example, a lot of countries in the world have single payer healthcare systems. From what I understand, there's very good evidence that this is preferable, right? Now, if that weren't the case, if it were the case that the U.S. system was outperforming the systems, generally speaking, that had single-payer healthcare, I would be far less likely to be in favor of it. Because again, I do care about the evidence.
Yes.
In this case, it seems to be, from what I understand, pretty uncontroversial and inarguable that some move in that direction would be positive for our society. So this is something that can be empirically verified. Now, if you're talking about something like the other thing I was proposing with potential changes to the way we produce and distribute food, that's a very wild thing that would require a lot of establishment. If you made me supreme dictator of the US, I wouldn't just do that, because you would need to investigate the best way to solve that problem. So I have inclinations in this direction for reasons that probably can't just be argued out of, but you could argue me out of any particular policy position. So for example, the thing I already conceded with college, I just don't think that that's an effective way to deal with things. And also something I hadn't brought up before, I'm generally speaking against student loan debt forgiveness because it seems to be a really regressive policy. And also there is a sense in which even if it is unfair that we have to pay so much for college, you did take out the loan and there is a personal responsibility element there. So I've taken out student loans a number of times. I feel like it's my responsibility to pay them back.
Surprised you're heavy on the personal responsibility and having the beliefs that you hold. You're quite a character, I should say, and I like that. Anyways, given that you're going to be an upcoming YouTuber, and I already judging from the feedback that you have received, a lot of people seem to be on the right who watch you. Does that change your beliefs in any meaningful ways, or would you be more willing to look at the evidence from the right?
I mean, I don't think you look at evidence from the right or the left. It's just the evidence, right? I mean, like I disagree. Like I'm on the left, and I disagree with a lot of things that lefties think, right?
That's right.
It should be pretty obvious from the interview. So like, I have an upstream position that is extremely opposed to tribalism. I don't like people just sort of taking their teams and just arguing their position and ignoring counter evidence. I find all that to be really disgusting. And this, did something just happen?
No, nothing happened. But I do have a question regarding tribalism. If, for example, a tribalist were to be open with you, and if something has, if you prove them wrong, then they're wrong, right? Would you be able to at least look at their evidence, given that they come with a good faith and they are pretty open?
Well, I mean, I don't really care what someone believes. If they give me a good reason to question my own beliefs, I'm happy to take it. Okay. What I'm saying is that if I give incontrovertible evidence that someone is wrong, the likelihood that they'll change their mind is quite low. At least that's been my experience. Most people, I don't think people are really. So this is going to be, if I keep making videos, which I'm almost certainly will. This is going to be one of the major themes is pointing out people's tribalistic bias. So a lot of people have taken issue. They're like, oh, there's all these people that I find disgusting that like your content. And first of all, obviously they would. I shit on Vaush harder than anyone else has shit on Vaush, probably, right? I mean, the people who don't like Vaush are going to like it. That's the most obvious thing in the world. But beyond that, I really hate the idea that you can't have a conservative friend. I really hate the idea that you can't talk to somebody who has ideas that you object to. I don't know much about you. I'm guessing that we have some pretty serious disagreements with regards to the stuff about, like
Yes.
dysgenic policies. I think we have a pretty serious disagreement there. But I would much rather just sit here and talk to you politely and not call you a racist. I think that that's much more productive. And a big part of the problem I have is that the audience of someone like, not necessarily someone like you, but the audience of someone like Sargon is very likely going to have extremely negative views about left-wing people.
That's
and to put it bluntly,
I think
a
my
lot.
audience will have an even stricter view about left-wing people, to a point where even I express a certain left-wing opinion, they get triggered. I'm sure while watching this video, I mentioned anti-Semitism and homophobia, and of course, a lot of people will get triggered because I did that.
I really don't like. I think first of all that part of that is justified because a lot of our politics has become this factional warfare, and a lot of people who would agree with me on a lot of things have been incredibly rude and unfair. So I can understand part of why that happens, but there isn't going to be any movement forward if that is the case. If everybody just hates everyone who disagrees with them politically, we can't have conversations, we can't sort things out. It just becomes this sort of Foucauldian power game, and it's unproductive. It's stupid.
It is unproductive. When I said, like, when you said tribalism, I thought something else completely. I thought higher in positive ethnocentrism and presumably also higher in negative ethnocentrism. But you did talk about political tribalism, and I do agree with you. Although I, of course, still engage in it, I don't think that my political tribalism is necessarily makes me closed to new evidence. And I did make a good video about tribalism, so perhaps when you're doing a research for your video, you can take a look at mine. It has some interesting studies. But anyway,
and really quickly, when I say tribalism, I don't just mean, I mean, I'm kind of referring to a lot of things. I'm referring to like nationalism, I'm referring to like political factionality. Just generally speaking, people don't like questioning their preconceptions. People have these ideas they have about the world, and what they want to do is go out and confirm their preconceptions. That's why a lot of people who produce content, they produce content from a very narrow perspective, and they never deviate from it. I can predict anything that Lance is going to say before he says it, because Lance is never going to say something that would cause his audience to question the left-wing narrative. And I don't know anything about Sargon. I suspect that Sargon's probably pretty similar, that he's very rarely going to deviate from a very particular perspective that his audience wants, right?
Yes.
And I don't hate any of these people, but I don't like that element of things. I wish things had more nuance. I don't like the general feeling that people have of just hating one another, and particularly hating one another to the point where they will reject everything they have to say. And it becomes a crime just to have this person like your content. I mean, that is really wild. And generally speaking, if someone, the buying into that, I don't think it's an exclusively left-wing thing, right? I've hung out in plenty of conservative spaces, and I've heard plenty of negative things about, me liking Bernie Sanders, for example. It's not exclusively a left-wing thing, but it is largely a left-wing thing, and I don't like that. I
also like
I want to
Bernie
push back
Sanders
against that.
I mean, I wish he didn't cock to the establishment, but I think he would have been a better president than Trump had he been elected. But, well, that's mostly also because I don't feel like Trump. But I'm still a right-winger. Anyways, damn, I had... Oh, yes. Here's a question. Since you brought up political tribalism, and we both agree that it's a bad thing... Now, we don't necessarily agree on, like, nationalism or whatever, but we certainly agree on that one. And here's the thing. How would you, I guess, minimize political tribalism so that we don't deal with it as much as we do, and so that we're more open to evidence from the other side?
Okay, so I have a lot of thoughts on that. I can't reveal all of that because
Mm-hmm.
this is going to be content I'm producing, right?
Okay.
But
Yes.
one of the things
Give
is
me
having
a
conversations
trailer
like
or a teaser.
yeah. So one of the things is having conversations like this. Again, I think that we disagree on a lot. I'm basically just talking to anyone. I don't care who they are. Um, I pretty sure at the moment I'm willing to just like go on a straight up Nazi channel and talk to them because I want to be able to talk to anyone. I want to be able to give an empathetic reading to people and talk to people without just screaming at them, which is what most conversations have become. I think that that's necessary in order to break this factionalization. Because let's say that this isn't to say anything about you. I know nothing. I know very little about you, right? But let's say that someone has a Nazi community. The general thinking is, well, if anyone will even entertain this, they're less than human. Let's just completely extricate them from society. Let's not. No one should talk to them. Anyone who talks to them, they're also a Nazi, right? This is the basic manner of thinking. Now, what is the completely predictable result of that? Well, anyone who entertains any of these thoughts, if they ever enter this space at all, well, now they're just going to get pushed completely crazy far in that direction because no one else will talk to them. Everyone else will just exile them from society. No one else will even be willing to acknowledge them. Anytime they express any of these ideas, everyone is just going to basically call them Hitler. And
You're
therefore,
absolutely right. Yes.
the only people that they'll socialize with and the only people that they'll talk to are people that are going to be incredibly, incredibly, incredibly rude to them.
Yes, and
Now,
it will bring, birth extremism.
yes, exactly. Now, personally, I don't think the reason that people become Nazis has as much to do with Nazi beliefs as it does to do with a desire to have
Social
sort of a
alienation.
social alienation and a social community. And by treating people that way, you're just making it worse. So if I talk to someone who said some Nazi shit, I think it's a lot better that I could push back on them from an empathetic perspective where I'm just talking to them and not screaming at them. And that if their audience is able to see, hey, here's someone who likes Bernie Sanders, who's on the left, who wants to push society in this direction, but they don't just immediately hate me. They don't think that I should, lose my job and go to jail just for, thinking something. I think that that is much more productive. And this is an extreme example, obviously. I'm not
Yes.
necessarily sure that I'm ever going to talk to a Nazi,
Yeah.
but this
Can I just?
this absolutely applies to like a normal conservative because
It does.
people on the left would have the same perspective for just a normal conservative who has very, very standard positions, like being skeptical of immigration, for example. The same thing that I'm establishing would apply there, where a lot of people on the left aren't even willing to have that conversation. They would think that if you're willing to entertain this conversation, that makes you a bad person, and I think that that's ridiculous. You need to be able to have that conversation.
Yes.
Otherwise, you'll have everyone just at each other's throats.
Okay. Can I just? I completely subscribe to every single word you said, but I'll just have to clear it out for the viewers so that there are no, I guess, misconceptions. I don't have a lot of Nazis who watch me.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to be clear. It's nothing to
Yes.
do with you. Yeah, this is
Yes,
just the
but
most
just
extreme
in
example.
case, I know you don't,
Yeah.
but sometimes people do, and frankly, I've taken a couple of political compass tests. I'm not even an authoritarian. I'm definitely not like as you would say, a progressive left winger at all. But I'm not an authoritarian. I'm not a socialist. I'm not preaching violence, and etc. So just a heads up. And
Yeah, no implication on you. It's just that like
yes.
that probably is something that I'm willing to do that most people would find pretty wild. But that's the sort of thing that I think is necessary. It's
Yes.
kind of like that. I think his name's Daryl Dennis or something like that. That dude, he was like a black dude who was a musician who would go talk to people in the KKK.
I
It's
think did he make a video on Vox?
yeah. That guy's awesome.
Okay.
It's kind of like that. That
I've
sort of
seen it.
empathetic engagement. I think that is one of the crucial things that is necessary to break political polarization.
Yes, and I think it is also good for de-radicalizing people whenever they are Nazis and I guess far leftists. Who, by the way, I do have received quite a few letters, and they said that I either helped them to move to the right, or either, for example, one was even more radical right, and then they embrace my position, and I very much like it, and I think we should do things like that more, and on both sides, so that there are no extremists. However, we also need to expand the what's it called, the Overton window, so that people with views who are not, let's say, considered normal in sociology departments or Hollywood, like necessarily be ostracized from society, so they then radicalize and become extremists. So I was wondering, what is your opinion with regards to expanding the Overton window?
Well, I mean, I don't think Nazi ideas are acceptable at all. Like, I think that if someone expresses Nazi ideas, it's completely like that should be very firmly attacked. I just don't think that like I don't like the idea that because someone posted on a forum that like they lose their job. I really don't like that idea.
Let's talk about Darwinian politics and for example, criticism of minority groups, hardline immigration, and research on racial differences. Those things that I'm talking about. But with regards to Nazis, I mean, you know, we could probably even agree, but probably I don't think the government should be censoring them. So what do you think about expanding the Overton window to those ideas, not Nazism?
So personally, like the whole race realism meme, I think that basically entertaining the conversation has externalities that probably supersede the utility of the conversation. If you're, it opens a bag of worms that I don't like. So again, I'm like firmly opposed to tribalism. What I would want is to talk about people's innate differences as little as humanly possible. I don't want innate differences written into law. I don't want innate differences. So I'm pretty opposed to all of this.
The problem with it is that when people think that people are equal, they come up with very strange, I guess, reasoning patterns and believe in things such as systemic racism, for example. There's actually a very good defense against your argument. It's called Research on Group Differences in Intelligence, a defense of free inquiry by Nathan Kofnes. And he does look at your argument, as well as another guy, Russell Warren, 35 Myths About Intelligence. They do address your argument. And what's his name? Rainer Rinderman's survey of experts on IQ from 2013 to 2014 that was published in 2020, more than 80% of people who were surveyed, which is 265 people who have at least have an expertise in intelligence, so they published at least one article, right? Unlike most people, and the conclusion was that 80% of those experts believe that the conversations about it will not contribute to racism or to other forms of hatred. That's a direct polling, and from very respectful people.
Sure. I mean, it's difficult for me to argue about literature that I haven't read, but like if you were to look, for example, at Holocaust skepticism, it's very people will try to have a air quotes nuanced conversation about exactly what happened. I see basically zero utility in that beyond just pushing in the direction of Holocaust denial. That I don't see any utility in that. You could say, oh well, it's just a free marketplace of ideas. It's like, but the utility that could be gained from figuring out that there's the historical record right now is slightly wrong in some trivial way just doesn't matter compared to the force that you would give towards people who are just trying to delegitimize the concept of the Holocaust in general.
Yes.
There's a potential incredible cost there. And it's the same.
I do agree that there is a cost. I have still a question with regards to the Holocaust. So, for example, the main problem with it is where the line of denial is drawn. So, for example, the ADL thinks that Norman Finkelstein with his book, I believe it's called The Holocaust Industry. It's talking about how certain people are, I guess, exploiting this strategy of people who suffered from it in order to score political points, right? And some people would consider this to be a form of Holocaust denial. And for example, don't get me wrong. I accept the mainstream understanding of what happened, and more to it than that, I have relatives who were the victims of the Holocaust in Romania. So I in no way think that like my point is that there has to be sometimes criticism of even that event, and some people will use this criticism as a form to shut down the speech of another person. So for example, I don't believe what was the other guy who was with Deborah Lipstadt in the early 2000s, David Reich, or what's his name, do you remember the famous guy who claimed that there weren't any gas chambers?
I don't remember his name.
Yeah, I mean, I think even a conversation like that has to be even entertained. But I mean, obviously it's wrong. But the problem is that, for example, in the intelligence community, what I don't like is that a conversation about like 100% environmental differences in intelligence, not even just across racial groups, is being pushed, and like they're having to say this, and we know it's wrong. And by the way, we know that that other Holocaust denial historian, we also know that it's wrong as well. But you see a double standard, and I understand your concern for the not allowing people who are Holocaust denials to be running around, but at the same time we have people who are running around who don't even believe that there are genetic differences between populations or within populations, and I think their damage to society is far greater, at least right now.
Would you consider yourself a collectivist?
No, I probably am somewhere in between individualist or collectivist, so I wouldn't consider myself that.
So I'm curious, what do you think the ultimate purpose of society should be?
No ultimate purpose of society should be to maintain group cohesion and pass on good genes. So that's the purpose, and presumably live in a high culture, and that applies to everyone regardless of race. I don't think it's unique to somebody.
Where is the line in terms of passing on good genes? Because there's probably a lot of things that you could do.
I don't endorse negative eugenics at all. I just want people to improve genetically as we progress. So for example, I don't like the fact that we're getting less smarter like over the years. I don't like the fact that like since the 1980s the average height of a person who is 19 years old has been declining. I don't like the fact that we're getting fatter and etc. Right? So
intelligence is declining. Isn't there the Flynn effect?
Well, yes. Okay. The Flynn effect applies to countries. It mostly applies to countries who started in a very poor positions. The Flynn effect has been there is no Flynn effect in the West until after the 2000s. There was a Flynn effect, that's true. And by the way, the people who are talking about the Flynn effect, even Flynn himself admits that the Flynn effect is it's not really that much G-loaded. It's not genotypic, it's phenotypic. People are just pushed to their maximum abilities, and the Flynn effect has been declining in the West, that's true. The Flynn effect is rising right now in Africa. There is evidence that it is rising at least until 2017 in Russia, and there is evidence that it also rises in other countries. However, this is just because those countries have a very bad environment that keeps them from reaching their genetic maximum. Eventually the Flynn effect will stop there. Right now in the West, what we're experiencing is negative Flynn effect, and also known as the Woodley effect. So so that's that.
Okay, so you haven't thus far, you seem interested in this, and it seems that your interest largely lies in disagreeing with certain positive policy prescriptions of people on the left, right?
No.
Like
I
like
want a
a
policy prescription of my own. I would want the society to be run under, you know, to espouse the values that I just said. I don't. I do have something to offer. In fact, probably this year I will produce a video laying out my political beliefs.
Okay. Yeah. So again, there's there's a lot to respond to here.
Okay.
All I can really say is like what I think, right? I think that generally speaking, looking into these things is going to inarguably increase like tension between people. It is going to have a negative effect in terms of fixating on things. And I think that the main utility in this conversation is to discount a kind of conversation on the left that I already don't agree with and doesn't need to happen under the kind of world that I was proposing, right? So I don't like the idea that just because there's an inequitable outcome that you assume that something is necessarily wrong. What I instead would just prefer is to provide solutions that work for everyone. And let's say if one group is disproportionately disadvantaged, then any kind of intervention you could give in that area would disproportionately help them. And you don't need to write into law anything to do with race or anything like that. And personally, I am very individually focused. I don't like the idea that restrictions would be made, basically in an effort to cultivate the gene pool, you could say.
Well, I wasn't arguing for negative eugenics, as I said. I'm fine with like abortion going on as it is and other social programs. I'm just in favor of people getting more educated about dysgenics and things such as that. I'm not in favor of actually government forcibly sterilizing certain people. That's things that I absolutely I don't subscribe to.
Yeah, I mean, I would have a hard time imagining any policy prescription along these lines that I would be okay with personally.
Yes.
Just because
Yeah, the negative eugenics of the 20th century and its bad implementation in Nazi Germany was a catastrophe.
I mean,
that's not. Yeah.
I mean, you don't even have to invoke Godwin's law. It's just there's there's some very uncomfortable things here. And okay, so the last thing I'll say on this, I'll give you sort of an example, so that I think your audience will help you understand my perspective. When people talk about white privilege, the only thing they want to talk about is the truth value of the statement. It's like, is there white privilege? And then if you can see that there's a non-zero amount, that's the only conversation they want to have. Okay, well, white privilege exists, therefore all these things, right? So so
you just I got very excited because I really much like to talk about white privilege. I actually did produce a video. Like I didn't know like it would go for so long. I don't know. Can we like discuss white privilege and then we we could probably end this with a final statement from you, I guess. Because
sure.
It's a thing that I care very much about. But I'll let you say your piece first. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So if all you wanted to do was discuss a truth claim, I think that there are things you have to concede in terms of white privilege. However, I really don't like the conversation because what happens when you concede those claims is that people take that as the end of the conversation, and now race is inserted into every conversation you have about anything, such that if something good happens for a white person, people will feel justified in saying, oh, well, you have white privilege, so that was due to white privilege. And it's very difficult to escape that happening. And if something bad happens to a black person, they will say, oh, well, you live in a white supremacist society, other people have white privilege. Yes. So this bad thing happened to you because of that, okay? And I think that probably the majority of people, including you, I'm assuming, would agree that this is sort of a problem, right? So you have...
No, I disagree. But go ahead.
You disagree that this happens?
Well, I disagree that white people succeeding in certain things is a form of a problem. This is where I disagree.
Okay, well that's not the claim. The claim is just that. Yeah. So if you look at any, like if you take a data set that's big enough, you can always find ways in which things manifest, right? So the claim would always be trivially true. The question is to what degree it is empirically true. And what I would want in order for this to be something that I was strongly advocating for is an indication that any white person would necessarily have an advantage over other people, which, as far as I'm concerned, is not something that I've seen argued adequately. What there seems to be is a greater proportion of white people that are born into circumstances for which they will thrive, right? But the thing is that doesn't necessarily apply to any individual person. But this gets applied in an individual and essentialist way, such that you could have someone who is, let's say, white and born into poor circumstances, and people would still say they have white privilege, which I think is quite that's a problem. That's not okay.
We agree. By the way, there's nothing, if we're talking about empirical stuff, that you mentioned that I disagree with, by the way. And I feel like your critique is a very good one. What I'm most concerned about is just the discourse of white privilege. And I think it seems to be a bit hypocritical. So, for example, if you like to measure white privilege in terms of, well, how it's usually measured, and it's like how the police treats you, and we both know that police treats blacks worse than it treats whites, well, statistically speaking. Sorry, when it comes to arrests, actually, if a police is aiming at a black person, they are less likely to shoot them. That's Roland Fryer's study, and there are also good, I guess, studies to support that. But if we're talking about population level overall, and I think the police, they feel a certain, I guess, prejudice in monitoring into like black neighborhoods. There is some truth into that. I think there's a point to be made. And also, when you're talking about wealth, income, of course, and like IQ, whites are substantially better. If your definition of white privilege is like that, then I feel like you're doing a disservice to white people in making them a target of an attack. Because so far it seems that on all these metrics, including the police interaction, Asian people, they seem to be very, they seem to be more privileged than white people. And here's the question: why are we focused on white people when there is an ethnic group that is clearly more socially privileged? So this is the problem that I found with the white privilege narrative.
Sure, but so really quickly, I mean, there's some element of that I would agree with. Okay. So we just agreed on something, that when you introduce this idea, you've introduced an idea that sort of permeates everything. Where if you accept some of the principles of white privilege, then it sort of enters into every conversation. Where anytime anything good happens for a white person, people will start to think, oh, well, that's white privilege. Anytime anything bad happens to a black person, they'll start to think,
whites? Why not focus on Asians? That's my point.
Well, the exact same thing would happen regardless of who you focus on. So my point is that there's this fixation on sort of a trivially true thing that, of course, there's going to be some level of difference. And then out of that, you get something that's very bad, which is basically that racism gets introduced into every conversation, the perception of bigotry, the perception of problems. This sort of permeates everything if you accept the theses. And I think something very similar happens when you look at race realist arguments, where as soon as you even go down the line of thinking, okay, well, we're going to analyze these things by race. If we find a difference, well, okay, yeah, you can potentially find a difference, but the outcomes of the conversation itself are going to be far more toxic than any potential utility that you could gain from learning something that would be supposedly a fact that you're discovering. And of course, there's always problems with these conversations. I mean, if you wanted to have motivated reasoning and find a conclusion, you can always find a conclusion along certain lines. If you wanted to find some kind of racial differences in genetics, but it introduces a problem in that if someone wants to think a certain way, you've now introduced it exactly the same way as white privilege into every conversation, where people could think, oh, well, of course things are bad for black people because black people are stupid. And that to me is a far bigger problem than any utility that you could gain by opening the conversation at all. And I would much rather just, generally speaking, not entertain the conversation. Not that I think the government should stop people from talking about it or anything like that, but I don't find it interesting because I don't really care why these differences happen. I don't think that the standard should be held on individuals that comes from groups, even if there's a problem with a group that a person belongs to. I don't think that standard should ever be held to an individual person, and I just want people to get help, right?
I understand your concern, and it's certainly, as Russell Warren has demonstrated in his book, when you account for individual IQ and when you account for race, your prediction is way higher than when you would just account for race. And what's also interesting is when you account for individual intelligence and you also account for something else I've forgotten, your prediction is even more accurate than if you would account for race and you would account for intelligence. I mean, in individual difference in intelligence, IQ. So,
so speaking as a data analyst, even if a model becomes better, that doesn't mean your model is good. So like these,
it's actually it's in favor of your point, and trust me, I don't want to like I guess race realism thing to be applied on individual people. I think it.
So what I'm just saying is that predicting something about an individual is incredibly difficult. You can make predictions about groups of people, and they can be somewhat accurate, but predictions about an individual person are they're going to be comically bad. And
I mean, if your individual, for example, happens to suffer from schizophrenia, happens to, have quite a few other things, or like, for example, being bisexual and being low in intelligence, you would assume that their, for example, if we look at mental illnesses, that you would assume that their levels of mental illnesses is going to be very high without actually talking to that person.
Well, in the case of schizophrenia, they have, perhaps like one of the most severe mental illnesses. So, I mean, yeah, that's like saying if you talk to someone who plays basketball, they're going to be tall.
Yeah,
it's like, well, you have to be tall to play basketball.
That was probably a bad example. I should have probably said suffers from depression. So I'll give you credit there. Yeah.
I mean, depression and anxiety are going to be highly. If you look at the comorbidity of anything in the DSM, depression and anxiety are going to be mentioned, basically.
Anyways, let's return to white privilege for a moment. I mean, it seems to be true that there are similarities between white privilege discourse and race realism. I will give you that. However, you haven't even answered the question about like why not just focus on Asians, right? What was your reply? I don't think it was sufficient.
I mean, my reply is that it's inherently disgusting to emphasize these things and that we shouldn't do it. I don't think we should talk about privilege along the dimension of race because it doesn't apply to individuals. The fact that an individual
it does correlate with individuals. That's the
point. Well, no, okay. You could say whatever you want.
But there is a correlation. Like you can't really.
It's not a meaningful correlation. If you were to look at the group, at the group of white people, it wouldn't tell you anything about me. That you could prove something like 1350, and that wouldn't say anything about an individual black person. It doesn't mean that individual black person is more likely. No. Hold on.
Okay, go ahead.
It doesn't mean that an individual black person would be more likely to commit crime. What that actually reflects is the idea that black people are more likely to be born into the circumstances that are going to lead someone to engage in that activity. So if you were to take a black person who is, for example, middle class, there's no increased chance, as far as I know, there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that a black person born into middle-class circumstances is going to be more likely to engage in violent crime. What that reflects is the idea that if you more than a white person born into similar circumstances. Yes. What that reflects is that a black person is more likely to be born, let's be more clear. Of the people that are born in these, let's say, impoverished and high crime areas, they're very likely to be black. And that's where the majority of violent crime comes from. That's what that reflects. But there's an implication that you take from that black people are violent, which is not true. And it is a very, very dangerous idea to take that idea, again, because if you look at people who are born into middle-class circumstances, that wouldn't apply whatsoever. Really what we're looking at is...
if you control for race.
No, it won't. Because the violence is not a result of their race. The violence is a result of their environment.
No, that's there are gene to environment interactions, obviously, but there are, for example, there was a paper, I believe it was by J. Philip Rushton, and he looked at the amount of melanin and crime-related behavior, not just in humans but across the animal kingdom. And we know for a fact that blacks, for example, they have a lower level of IQ, and lower level of IQ correlates strongly with intelligence. And we also know that if you control for like class, high class black people would commit more crimes than low class white people. I don't have the citation right now at hand, but I'm willing to link it in the video.
Okay, so let's say that you have two different populations of people. Let's say Americans and Canadians, and let's say that we had the observation that Americans are 1/4 of a standard deviation taller on average, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that would be a meaningful thing to point out if you were to let's say that you're going to meet a hypothetical American,
Yes.
and you know that Americans are 1/4 of a standard deviation taller on average? Do you think that that's a meaningful difference, that you should actually think about that when you're meeting this person, or should you just treat this like a person that you're meeting that you don't know anything about?
Well, I'm not sure, but most people would probably make predictions based on their prior knowledge on the group that that person belongs to. Um, Look, we agree. I actually did agree with you in the beginning that I very much I don't want people to be judged individually based on their race. I very much agree with Martin Luther King there. But it's just some people would make predictions, and frankly, by the way, I grew up in Israel, and I was also I guess you would call experiencing racism against me because I was mostly Russian, and trust me, I don't really like when other people are doing it. However, why I'm defending this, well, by this I mean just looking into it more, is because first, the problem is that the opposite. We're now dealing with people who think that there are no meaningful differences between groups whatsoever. That's one. And second, you want to build a society that will be cohesive enough, right? And if your society has like certain racial conflicts that are helped to be driven by, for example, critical race theory, I think that that's a good antidote.
Well, so again, I've provided what I think is a better antidote, because again, there is going to be, there's going to be a lot of different claims in this sort of belief structure that you're interested in. There's probably at least one of them that I would give some legitimacy to, but there's an outcome that is very, very caustic, where people are going to take these ideas and apply them individually. And if what you care about is social cohesion, I think that my prescription is better, where these are just things that we, generally speaking, don't talk about, and certainly things that we don't put into law.
Well,
So,
yeah, okay, look, we certainly shouldn't put this into law. I mean, I'll just make it clear. But here's the problem. When you don't care about these things, you automatically care about, not you, but, people who are exposed to information, care about things like the critical race theory, things like, I guess, differences in outcomes means there's some sort of a systemic racism. You can't really ignore both, and as far as I know, you can't also stop people from participating in intelligence research, and now they're doing genomic wide associations tests, and frankly, I guess what referred to the race realist position hasn't been stronger than ever. So I think you do make a costly choice, and I would prefer this than the other.
well, as for critical race theory, nobody knows anything about it.
Well,
So I don't know that it's having much of an influence. The idea of systemic racism is, but critical race theory itself, like
sorry.
Vaush is a proponent of CRT. I'm not convinced that he knows anything about it.
Yeah, well, Abraham X. Kendi and what's her name, the author of White Fragility and Be
Robin
White Like
DiAngelo.
Me, yeah, Tim Wise and what's his name, Robert Ignatieff. I forgot, sorry, but those people, they're bestsellers. They influence a lot of people. If you look at like Amazon and look how many reviews their book has, and compare it to like a book 35 Myths About Intelligence by Russell Warren, who is an actual well-respected academic. And by the way, he makes very similar arguments that you make. You know, you see that there is a clear difference, and the overwhelming majority of people would rather prefer critical race theory than, for example, life history strategy or something else, right?
I mean, people don't. People's interests are not necessarily. I don't know. People are interested in some interesting things. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and they have large consequences. And for example, it fuels affirmative action. It fuels race-based admission. It fuels like diversity discussions. It has direct outcomes. That's what I'm concerned about, and I don't think it's particularly well. But anyways, sorry, that has been a very long conversation. I didn't expect it would be like almost 2 hours. It was very nice to talk with you. I'm very much surprised that you would be like this respectful and this calm, and that was a very good interview. And is there anything you would like to say before I end this recording?
Oh, no, I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, thank you for joining. Bye.
Later.
Yeah.